The sun rose slowly over the vast desert, casting long golden rays across the rolling dunes and rocky plains. Jack Thompson tightened the straps on his worn leather saddle. Squinting against the harsh light, he had been on the trail for days, guiding a small herd of cattle across the arid land. And the desert had already begun to test his endurance. The heat was relentless, and the wind carried only dry, burning dust that scratched at his face and filled his mouth with grit. Jack had traveled many miles through tough terrain before, but today, something felt different. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, a sense of isolation that weighed heavily on him. Jack's horse, a strong bay named Red, stumbled slightly on a patch of loose sand. Jack leaned forward instinctively, adjusting the reins, but the animal's heavy breathing and sluggish movements told him something was wrong. The desert had been generous to Red so far, but now it was taking its toll. Jack dismounted, patting Red's neck gently, trying to calm the horse and reassure himself at the same time. He could feel his own body weakening as well. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared. Sweat ran down his face, soaking his shirt, and his mouth felt parched. He had a canteen strapped to his saddle, but it was nearly empty, and the water inside was already warm and bitter. He scanned the horizon, hoping to see some sign of life, a cluster of trees, a distant stream. Anything but the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. The isolation was overwhelming. Jack knew the desert could be beautiful at times, with its golden sands and wide-open skies. But now it seemed merciless, a vast, unforgiving expanse that offered no comfort, no relief. The thought of turning back never occurred to him. He had a job to finish, cattle to guide, and a sense of pride that would not allow retreat. By midday, Jack felt dizzy. His legs were stiff from hours in the saddle, and his vision blurred slightly from the heat. He stopped to rest under the small shadow of a rocky outcrop. It was not much, but it was the only cover he could find. He drank what little water he had left, savoring each drop as though it were a treasure. But it was not enough. His stomach growled painfully, and his throat felt like sandpaper. He had eaten a small breakfast that morning, a piece of bread and a slice of dried meat, but now it seemed a lifetime ago. Hunger gnawed at him, but thirst was far worse. The desert sun had burned off every bit of moisture in his body, leaving him weak and sluggish. Jack leaned back against the rocks, closing his eyes for a moment. Memories of home flickered in his mind, his small cabin, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the laughter of friends and neighbors. He had always been a strong, independent man, capable of surviving in tough conditions. But the desert had a way of humbling even the strongest. For the first time, he felt the creeping fear of helplessness. If he could not find water soon, he might not make it. The thought was terrifying, yet he pushed it aside, knowing that panic would only make things worse. As the afternoon wore on, the desert seemed to shift. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting sharp shadows over the sand, and the wind began to pick up, carrying clouds of dust that stung his eyes. Jack mounted Red again, hoping to cover more ground, but the horse's energy was fading. Each step was a struggle, and the sight of the cattle, scattered across the dunes, filled him with anxiety. They needed water and rest just as much as he did, and he could feel his responsibility pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Hours passed, and Jack's strength dwindled further. His mouth was dry, his throat parched, and his limbs ached from fatigue. He tried to focus on his breathing, taking slow, deep breaths to conserve energy. But the heat and exhaustion were relentless. His mind began to wander, imagining mirages on the horizon, shimmering pools of water that vanished when he drew closer. The desert seemed to toy with him, offering illusions of relief while keeping him trapped in its vast, unyielding grip. Nightfall came slowly, bringing a brief relief from the sun's heat but introducing new challenges. The temperature dropped sharply, and the desert became cold and unforgiving. Jack wrapped his thin coat around his shoulders, shivering as he tried to find a place to rest. He dismounted Red once more, letting the horse graze on the sparse desert grass. There was little to eat, but it was enough to keep the animal alive for now. Jack found a small patch of sand between some rocks and lay down, staring at the star-filled sky. The universe stretched endlessly above him, vast and silent. For a moment, he felt both insignificant and deeply connected to the world around him. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the sounds of the desert, distant howls, the rustling of small animals, the whispering wind through the rocks. Jack dreamed of water, of rivers and lakes, of cool shade under tall trees. He woke several times, thirsty and restless, and each time he felt the desert pressing in on him more heavily. His body ached, his muscles cramped, and he began to feel the first signs of dehydration, dizziness, dry lips, and a pounding headache. He knew he had to keep moving, but each step was becoming more difficult. By morning, Jack was barely able to walk. Red, too, was exhausted. Refusing to move forward without constant encouragement, Jack's pride and stubbornness were still there, but survival instincts were taking over. He scoured the horizon for any sign of life, any hint of water, but the desert stretched endlessly, unforgiving and silent. Each moment was a battle, each breath a struggle. The sun rose again, relentless and merciless, baking the earth and reminding him of the danger he faced. Jack stumbled along the desert floor, leaning on Red for support. His mind began to wander in fragments, memories of home, the sound of running water, the faces of friends and family all mingling with the harsh reality around him. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, and he realized that if he did not find help soon, he might not survive the day. His eyes burned from the sun and dust, his mouth was parched beyond words, and his body was trembling from exhaustion. The desert had tested him, and he was nearing his limit. Even as despair crept in, Jack refused to give up. There was a stubborn fire in him, a refusal to surrender to the harshness of the land. He pressed forward slowly, step by step, guided by instinct and determination. The desert seemed endless, but he knew that somewhere, beyond the dunes and rocks, there might be life, water, and salvation. He could not stop. He would not stop. Survival demanded courage, and he had learned the hard way that courage was sometimes the only thing that kept a man alive in such unforgiving conditions. By midday, Jack collapsed once more, this time fully exhausted. Red stood nearby, panting heavily, offering silent companionship in the vast emptiness. Jack rested his head on the warm sand, closing his eyes and trying to conserve what little strength remained. He thought of the stories he had heard of cowboys lost in the desert, men who had wandered too far and never returned. He did not want to be one of them. Somehow, he had to survive. Somehow, he had to find a way. As he lay there, feeling the heat of the sun on his back and the rough sand beneath him, Jack realized that the desert would not let him leave easily. It demanded respect, endurance, and an unyielding spirit. He had faced challenges before, but never like this. The isolation, the hunger, the thirst. It was more than physical. It was a test of the mind and soul. Jack understood that survival was not just about strength, it was about hope, patience, and the will to keep moving forward, even when every step was agony. And so, as the sun climbed high again, burning the desert with its relentless heat, Jack pushed himself to rise. He adjusted Red's saddle, took what little water remained, and continued his journey. Every step was a battle, but he refused to surrender. The desert was harsh and merciless, but Jack's determination burned brighter. Somewhere beyond the endless dunes, beyond the scorching heat and biting wind, there was hope. He would find it or die trying. Jack had been wandering the desert for what felt like an eternity. His steps were heavy, his body weak, and each breath felt like it took all his strength. The relentless sun beat down on him, and the sand beneath his boots seemed to shift with every step, as if the desert itself were conspiring to slow him down. He had no food, and the little water he had left was gone. Thirst burned deep in his throat, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. His mind grew foggy with fatigue, and his thoughts blurred into a mixture of despair and stubborn determination. As he trudged along, Jack's eyes caught a movement far in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the desert, a mirage like the ones he had seen before, pools of water that shimmered and disappeared as he approached. But this movement was different. It was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Jack squinted, shielding his eyes with a hand, trying to make out the figure. It was a woman, moving carefully across the sand. Her clothes simple, and her head covered with a scarf to protect her from the sun. At first, Jack hesitated. He had spent his life in rugged independence, and pride was a part of him. Approaching a stranger, especially in such a desolate place, was risky. There were stories of danger, of encounters gone wrong, but as he watched her move with calm confidence, something in him stirred a spark of hope he had not felt in days. His body ached, his lips were cracked, and his eyes were dry and burning. He realized that he might not survive much longer on his own. Gathering what little energy he had left, he called out, his voice hoarse and weak. The woman stopped and turned slowly. Her eyes, dark and clear, met his across the distance. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet strength, a sense of calm awareness. Jack took another step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the details of her face. She was an Apache widow. As he would later learn, a woman who had faced her own hardships and losses but had survived through courage and resilience. She looked at him with curiosity and concern, sensing the desperation in his movements, the weakness in his steps. Jack stumbled as he approached her, his legs barely holding him up. The woman did not flinch or step back. Instead, she came closer, extending her hand, not with fear but with a gesture of help. Jack, surprised by her calmness, lowered his pride and accepted it. She guided him to a small patch of shade under a cluster of rocks, where the sun's heat was less harsh. He collapsed onto the sand, unable to stand any longer, and felt a wave of relief wash over him. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Ahioka, moved silently, checking his condition with careful hands. She could see the signs of extreme dehydration. The dry, cracked lips, the sunburned skin, the shallow breathing. She offered him a small skin of water, which he took greedily, drinking it slowly but desperately. Each sip brought a measure of life back into his body, and Jack felt tears sting his eyes. It had been so long since he had felt relief, since he had been shown such simple, quiet kindness. Ahioka did not speak much. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She gathered a few small branches and stones to create a small seat for him, keeping him off the burning sand. She shaded his face with her scarf, using her own strength to make his condition more bearable. Jack, weak and humbled, could only watch and marvel at her calm efficiency. In her presence, the desert seemed a little less hostile, the sun a little less unforgiving. As the hours passed, Jack regained a little strength, enough to sit upright with her help. His pride still urged him to ask questions, to speak, but he found himself unable to form coherent sentences. He had never been so dependent on another person before, and it humbled him. Ahioka, sensing his need for sustenance, prepared some edible plants she had gathered along the desert edge. They were simple, bitter, but nourishing enough to keep him alive. Jack ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Throughout their time together, Jack could not help but notice the quiet dignity in Ahioka's movements. She had faced hardship herself, he realized, surviving in a harsh desert long before he had arrived. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, only determination and understanding. She seemed to know instinctively what he needed, when he needed it, and how to give it without causing him shame or embarrassment. Jack felt a mix of awe and gratitude, emotions he was not accustomed to expressing openly. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Jack's exhaustion returned. His body had been so depleted that even the water and small meal could not restore him completely. Ahioka helped him lie down, making him as comfortable as the desert would allow. She stayed close, keeping watch as the shadows lengthened. Jack, lying on the sand, felt a strange sense of peace amidst the fear and uncertainty. He realized that sometimes survival was not just about finding water or food, but about finding someone willing to help without expectation, someone whose courage and care could keep a person alive against the odds. Night fell, and the desert transformed. The air cooled, and the heat of the day was replaced by the biting chill of the desert night. Jack shivered beneath his thin coat, but Ioka used what little she had to shield him, sharing her warmth silently. The stars above were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds. Jack, too weak to speak much, watched them and felt a flicker of hope. He thought about home, about his life before this desert, and he realized that he had been given a second chance, a chance he might not have had without Ahioka's intervention. Over the next few days, Ahioka's care continued. She provided him with water and shade, helping him to regain strength slowly. Jack's body was weak, but he began to move with a little more energy each day, guided by her steady hand. He learned to trust her, not just for survival, but in a deeper sense. He understood that in the vast, unforgiving desert, compassion could be more powerful than courage, and care could mean the difference between life and death. During these days, Jack and Ahioka shared moments of quiet communication. Words were few, but they were meaningful. She showed him how to find edible plants, how to read the desert for signs of water or shelter, and how to conserve his energy in the heat of the day. Jack listened, absorbing her knowledge with respect and humility. He realized that he had underestimated the desert and those who had learned to live in it. Ahioka had survived years in this harsh land, and her resilience inspired him. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, Jack felt a strange mix of fear and gratitude. Fear, because he knew he had been close to death, and gratitude, because he had been saved by a woman he barely knew. He wanted to thank her, to express the depth of his appreciation, but words seemed inadequate. Ahioka, sensing his emotions, simply smiled softly, a gesture that said more than words could. She had done what she had to do to save a life, and that was enough. By the end of the week, Jack had regained a measure of strength, though he was still far from fully recovered. The desert had tested him, pushed him to the brink, and shown him the fragility of life. He had faced the harshest elements, the relentless sun and the merciless sand, and yet he had survived. Survival, he realized, was never a solitary endeavor. It required courage, endurance, and sometimes the unexpected kindness of another human being. Jack's pride remained, but it had been tempered by experience. He had been forced to rely on Ahioka, to accept help from someone he would not have trusted under normal circumstances, and in doing so, he had learned a lesson more valuable than any cattle or reward he had ever sought. That true strength is not always measured by independence, but by the ability to accept support when life demands it. As Jack prepared to take his first steps toward a distant trail that might lead back to safety, he felt a new sense of determination. He had been saved from the brink of death by Ahioka, the Apache widow, whose courage, wisdom, and care had kept him alive. The desert was still vast and dangerous, but he no longer faced it alone. With her guidance and his renewed strength, he would continue his journey, aware of the fragility of life and the extraordinary impact of compassion. And in that quiet desert evening, with the stars beginning to twinkle overhead, Jack understood something he would never forget. Sometimes, life's most unlikely allies come in the form of quiet, steadfast human kindness, and it is that kindness that can keep a dying man alive, even in the harshest, most unforgiving places on earth. Jack woke slowly that morning, the soft light of dawn filtering through the rocks and dust around him. The desert had cooled slightly during the night, but the heat would soon return with a vengeance. He stretched his aching limbs and tried to sit up, but his body protested. Days without proper food and water had left him weak, and even standing seemed like a monumental task. He looked over at Ahioka, who was already awake, moving quietly to fetch water from a small clay container she had hidden earlier. Her movements were calm and deliberate, each one efficient and purposeful. Jack felt a mix of admiration and gratitude he could not have survived without her. Ahioka approached him with a small bowl of water. "Drink slowly," she said, her voice soft but firm. Jack nodded, taking careful sips, letting the cool liquid soothe his parched throat. Each swallow seemed to bring a little life back into his body. He had never realized how much the human body could suffer from thirst until now. The desert had a way of stripping away pride and independence, leaving only the raw need to survive. Jack had faced many challenges in his life, but nothing like this. After he had drunk enough to regain a little energy, Ahioka offered him a small portion of dried corn and berries she had collected. They were humble foods, but nourishing enough to begin restoring strength. Jack ate slowly, savoring each bite. He realized that survival was not just about food and water, it was about hope, patience, and the willingness to accept help when needed. Ahioka did not rush him, did not demand anything in return. She simply provided what he needed, and in doing so, she became a lifeline in the harsh desert. As the morning wore on, Jack tried to stand. His legs trembled under his weight, but with Ahioka's support, he managed a few unsteady steps. Each movement was a test of endurance and determination. The desert stretched endlessly before him. A vast expanse of sand, rocks, and scrub brush. He knew he could not stay in one place for long. Survival required movement, finding water and shelter before the sun became unbearable. Ahioka guided him slowly, pointing out safe paths and shaded areas where he could rest. The days that followed were a careful balance of rest and movement. Jack's strength returned gradually, and with it, his confidence. But the desert remained a constant challenge. The sun blazed overhead, and the sand reflected its heat, creating waves of shimmering light that seemed to distort reality. Jack learned to walk in the early hours of the morning and late afternoon, resting in the shade during the hottest parts of the day. Ahioka's knowledge of the land was invaluable. She taught him how to read the subtle signs of life in the desert, the tracks of animals, the direction of the wind, and the locations where water might be found beneath the sand. Despite the slow recovery, Jack's hunger remained a pressing concern. The food Ahioka provided was enough to sustain him, but not enough to fully restore his strength. One afternoon, as he sat under a small rock overhang, he felt his energy drain completely. His stomach ached, and his limbs felt like lead. Ahioka knelt beside him, her eyes filled with concern. She understood the limits of human endurance, and she knew that Jack needed something more to regain strength fully. It was then that she made a decision that would save his life. She offered him her milk. Jack hesitated, his pride struggling against his desperation. He had never been so dependent on anyone, and the idea of receiving such personal aid from a stranger made him uneasy. But the pain in his body, the weakness that threatened to overcome him, left him no choice. With a nod, he accepted. Ahioka's calm demeanor reassured him, and slowly, he drank the milk she provided. The effect was almost immediate. Jack could feel life returning to his body, his muscles regaining some of their lost strength. The milk was nourishing in a way that food and water alone could not provide. It gave him energy and hope, and he realized how vital Ahioka's decision had been. Survival often required difficult choices, he thought, and sometimes those choices involved accepting help that challenged one's pride. In the harsh desert, life depended on trust, courage, and the willingness to embrace the unexpected. As the days passed, Jack's health improved steadily. He walked longer distances, carried water, and even began gathering small amounts of food. Under Ahioka's guidance, their partnership became a rhythm, a dance of mutual trust and understanding. Jack learned to respect not just Ahioka's strength, but her wisdom. She had survived the desert long before he had arrived, and her experience was invaluable. Every action she took was deliberate, informed by years of living in a harsh environment, and Jack absorbed her lessons with humility and awe. During their journey, Jack reflected on his own life. He had always prided himself on independence and resilience, but the desert had humbled him. Survival was rarely about strength alone. It was about connection, about the support of others, and the wisdom to know when to accept help. Ahioka had shown him that life was fragile, and that courage and compassion often walked hand in hand. He realized that he would never forget her, the woman who had saved his life when hope seemed lost. The desert, though still harsh and unyielding, began to feel slightly less threatening. Jack could see how each plant, each rock, and each subtle shadow offered clues for survival. He learned to observe the land carefully, to anticipate dangers, and to act with patience. Ahioka's guidance was unwavering, and her presence gave him a sense of security he had not felt in days. With each step, he regained a portion of his former strength, and with each lesson learned, he gained a deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with shades of orange and red, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was no longer the weak, desperate man who had stumbled across the desert days before. He was stronger, wiser, and deeply aware of the gift of life that Ahioka had given him. He wanted to express his thanks, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture that spoke of trust, respect, and shared understanding. Ahioka returned the gesture with a quiet smile, acknowledging that their connection was beyond words. As the journey continued, Jack's recovery accelerated. The combination of food, water, and Ahioka's life-saving milk restored his strength fully. He walked confidently again, guiding Red along the desert paths and learning to conserve his energy in the heat of the day. The desert no longer seemed an endless expanse of danger, but a landscape that demanded respect and understanding. Jack had learned the importance of observation, patience, and humility. Through it all, the bond between Jack and Ahioka deepened. It was not romantic, but it was profound in its own way, a bond forged in adversity, rooted in trust and mutual dependence. Jack admired her resilience, her courage, and her quiet wisdom. She had saved him when all hope seemed lost, and in doing so, she had taught him lessons that went beyond survival. He understood now that heroism often came in quiet, selfless acts, and that sometimes the strongest people were those who gave life when others had none. By the end of this critical period, Jack was ready to face the desert with renewed confidence. He was no longer the weak, desperate man who had been on the brink of death. He had regained his strength, learned invaluable survival skills, and developed a profound respect for the woman who had saved him. The desert, once an enemy, was now a place he could navigate, with knowledge and caution. He understood its dangers, its beauty, and the delicate balance required to survive. Jack realized that the most extraordinary part of his journey had not been the struggle against the desert, but the human connection that had made survival possible. Ahioka's courage, selflessness, and wisdom had given him a second chance at life. He understood that true survival was about more than enduring hardships. It was about recognizing the value of kindness, the power of trust, and the importance of compassion. As they prepared to move toward a distant trail that promised the path back to civilization, Jack felt a quiet sense of determination. He knew challenges still awaited him, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had been given life when all hope seemed lost, and he would honor that gift by moving forward with courage and gratitude. The desert had tested him, pushed him to the edge of his endurance, and revealed the strength and beauty of the human spirit. In that vast, sun-drenched wilderness, Jack understood something he had never fully grasped before. Survival was not a solitary endeavor. It required courage, patience, knowledge, and above all, the compassion of another human being. Ahioka had shown him that even in the harshest, most unforgiving places, life could be preserved, hope could be restored, and human connection could become a source of extraordinary strength. The desert stretched endlessly before Jack and Ahioka as they prepared for the final part of their journey. By now, Jack had regained most of his strength. His legs no longer trembled with each step, and his body had recovered from the severe dehydration and exhaustion that had nearly claimed his life. Yet, the desert remained a formidable challenge. The sun rose early, casting its harsh golden light over the dunes, and the wind carried with it the dry, relentless heat. Every step required caution, every movement demanded energy, and every decision mattered. Jack had learned this well from Ahioka. Ahioka moved with her usual calm and confident grace, guiding him along paths she knew would offer the best chances for survival. She pointed out subtle signs in the sand animal tracks, small depressions where water might gather, shaded pockets beneath the rocks, and explained how to use these clues to navigate safely. Jack listened carefully, absorbing every word, every gesture, and every lesson. He had come a long way from the desperate, weakened man who had stumbled across the desert days before. Now, he was alert, aware, and prepared to follow her guidance with respect and trust. As the day wore on, the sun climbed higher, but the knowledge Ahioka had shared allowed them to move in relative comfort. They rested during the hottest hours, taking advantage of natural shade and conserving energy. Jack could feel his body growing stronger with each passing hour. The nourishment and care that Ahioka had provided, especially the milk that had saved his life, had restored him completely. He realized that survival was not just about food and water, but about the support and wisdom of someone who truly understood the land and the challenges it held. During their journey, Jack reflected on everything that had happened. He remembered the moment he had thought all hope was lost, the despair that had threatened to consume him, and the relief he had felt when Ahioka appeared. He thought about the lessons he had learned: humility, patience, trust, and the importance of accepting help when it was offered. The desert had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but it had also taught him the value of human connection and the extraordinary strength of compassion. As they walked, Jack noticed the subtle beauty of the desert in a way he had never seen before. The sand glowed with golden hues in the sunlight. The distant mountains shimmered with layers of color, and the sky stretched endlessly above, painted in brilliant shades of blue. For the first time, the desert felt alive, not just dangerous. Jack realized that he had been so focused on survival that he had overlooked its majesty. Now, walking alongside Ahioka, he could appreciate both its harshness and its beauty, understanding that respect for the land was as important as physical endurance. Hours later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes, they reached a small rocky ridge. From there, Jack could see a faint trail in the distance, winding toward what appeared to be a grove of trees. His heart leapt with hope. Civilization, or at least some form of human settlement, was near. The journey had been long and exhausting, but the end was finally in sight. Ahioka smiled gently, acknowledging his relief without words. Her quiet confidence had been a steady presence throughout, and now it guided him to the possibility of safety. Jack's steps grew more confident as they descended toward the trail. He could feel his strength returning fully, the aches and weakness of the past days fading. Red, their loyal horse, walked steadily alongside him, sensing that the danger had lessened. Ahioka kept a watchful eye on the surroundings, never letting down her guard, but Jack could see the satisfaction in her expression. They had endured together, and now they were nearing the reward of survival, a return to life beyond the desert. Along the trail, Jack began to speak more, sharing thoughts and gratitude that had been impossible to express during the earlier days. He told Ahioka of his life before the desert, of the cattle he had guided, the home he had left behind, and the pride he had carried in his independence. He admitted how the desert had humbled him, how he had realized the limits of his strength, and how her care had saved him. Ahioka listened quietly, offering nods and gentle smiles. She did not need words to understand. Her actions had already communicated her compassion and courage. As evening fell, they finally reached a small settlement at the edge of the desert. People came to see the travelers, curious and concerned, but Jack's focus was on the simple relief of safety. The sight of other humans, of buildings and familiar sounds, was almost overwhelming after so many days of isolation. He dismounted Red and stretched, feeling the firm ground beneath his feet, feeling the strength in his body return fully. The desert had tested him, but he had survived, thanks to Ahioka's unwavering support. Jack wanted to share the story of what had happened, to make sure the world knew of Ahioka's courage, but he realized that words would never fully capture it. Some experiences were too profound, too intimate, to be shared with everyone. Instead, he resolved to carry the memory with him, to honor her bravery and selflessness, in the quiet of his own life. He knew that survival had a price, but it had also brought him wisdom, gratitude, and a renewed understanding of what truly mattered. In the days that followed, Jack recovered fully and returned to his home and work, but he was forever changed. He moved with a deeper appreciation for life, with a humility that had been forged in the fires of the desert. He remembered Ahioka not just as a savior, but as a teacher, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that human kindness could transcend barriers of culture, pride, and circumstance. He shared the lessons he had learned with others, not to boast, but to inspire respect for the courage and compassion that could be found in the most unexpected places. Years later, Jack would recall the desert journey with vivid clarity. The scorching sun, the endless dunes, the relentless thirst, and the hunger, all of it came back in his memory. But more than that, he remembered the quiet strength of Ahioka, her unwavering presence, and the moment she saved his life with a simple, selfless act. He realized that the desert had been more than a trial. It had been a teacher. It had shown him the fragility of life, the power of human connection, and the extraordinary impact of compassion in the face of desperation. Jack often thought of Ahioka with deep respect. He wondered about her life, about the challenges she had faced as an Apache widow in a harsh land, and about the courage it must have taken to survive and help a stranger at great personal effort. He understood that her act was not just a moment of kindness, it was a testament to the resilience and humanity that could shine brightest in the darkest circumstances. He knew he would never forget her, and that the story of his survival would always be intertwined with her courage and wisdom. The desert journey had changed Jack in ways he could not have imagined. He had entered the vast, empty expanse as a proud, independent man, confident in his own strength. But he emerged humbled, wiser, and deeply aware of the importance of trust, patience, and compassion. He had learned that survival was rarely a solitary endeavor. It required courage, knowledge, and sometimes the selfless aid of another human being. The lessons of the desert remained with him, guiding him through the rest of his life. And in the quiet moments, when he reflected on what had happened, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had been saved from the brink of death, restored to life by a woman whose courage and kindness had transcended culture, pride, and circumstance. He understood that the world was filled with people capable of extraordinary compassion, and that sometimes survival depended not just on strength, but on the generosity and courage of others. The story of Jack Thompson and Ahioka, the Apache widow who saved him, became a personal legend he carried in his heart. It was a story of life and death, of the harsh realities of the desert, and of the remarkable humanity that could shine in moments of desperation. Jack never forgot the lessons he learned: to respect the land, to value trust and kindness, and to recognize the extraordinary power of compassion. And though Jack returned to his life as a cowboy, guiding cattle across the plains and facing new challenges, he carried the desert and Ahioka's courage within him. The experience had changed him forever, leaving an indelible mark on his soul, a reminder that sometimes life's most unlikely saviors come in quiet, unassuming forms, and that the strength of the human spirit is measured not only by endurance, but by love, care, and selfless courage. Jack often told himself, in silent reflection, that the desert had given him more than a second chance at life. It had given him wisdom, humility, and a profound respect for the kindness and courage of others. And in that respect, he knew that his survival had been a gift from Ahioka, the Apache widow, whose bravery and selflessness had ensured that his story did not end in the sands of the desert, but continued into the life he would live with gratitude and awareness forever.